Today we read from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verses 23 to 26. And tomorrow we celebrate Corpus Christi, or the day of thanksgiving for Holy Communion. You might think we do that on Maundy Thursday, the Feast of the Last Supper. But actually, there's so much going on that night that the actual institution of Holy Communion can pass almost unnoticed. So we have a separate feast for it. Paul in this passage repeats the words of institution, as we call them, the words of Christ at the Last Supper, which are familiar to us from the Eucharistic prayer that you hear every time you go to a Eucharist or a service of Holy Communion. Perhaps they're so familiar that we don't really hear them fully each time now, especially if we've been receiving communion for many, many years. Paul uses them here in a letter which predates the writing down of the Gospels. So we're in the year 54. Paul arrived in Corinth in the year 50 and spent 18 months there preaching the Gospel. The Christians he now writes to have been following the faith for a maximum of 4 years. Imagine that was you and me, converted 4 years ago, so in 2018, and looking back to Jesus' death and resurrection in about 1997. If we think about those dates, perhaps it brings it home to us how very new and recent this Jesus movement was. And perhaps how very excusable if the Corinthians didn't get everything quite right. And they didn't. It's striking that Paul tells them how he handed on all those details about what the Lord did and said at the Last Supper, word for word. Enacting this was already the central act of worship for the very young church. Paul in his letters doesn't refer to the parables or the miracles. Perhaps he didn't know them, since neither had the Gospels been written down nor circulated. But this act of remembrance he regarded as central, and from it flows all his teaching to the Corinthian Christians about how they ought to live, how they should live out their Christian faith. At the heart of it is the idea of unity. We who are many are one body because we share in one bread. As we come forward to receive the bread and perhaps now again the wine, we may come one by one, but this isn't a private act of worship. It's very much a corporate act of worship. We're deeply connected to each other through the body of Christ. We're connected to all believers who receive this sacrament across the world through the body of Christ. That's why we always pray in the intercessions for the worldwide church, and why in the Creed we say we believe in the Catholic Church, meaning the universal church. As we give thanks then for the gift of this wonderful sacrament, we must remember that it carries implications for us, implications about how we live. Most of the Christians in Corinth had perhaps a growing understanding of what it meant to follow this faith, as do we. Paul gave them short shrift about their divisions, their squabbles, their competitiveness, their showing off, their neglect of each other's needs. You can trace all these issues if you read the whole letter. And of course, I can imagine them cringing with embarrassment as they heard this letter read for the first time. Fair cop, Gov. Well, we too have our issues, don't we? I wonder what Paul would write, what he would put his finger on if he was writing a letter to us today, to you and me, or to the wider church now. We might usefully ponder what the epistle to us might say.